Hi everyone, not Jonathan here, but don't switch away just yet. My name's Christian, I'm Curator of Firearms here at the Royal Armouries, and if you are familiar with Battlefield 5, you might have seen this little bad boy in front of me here before, although it's not necessarily correct for that game. This is, as some of you may have guessed from the Facebook post, is the M3 carbine. So this was basically the first practical wide issue military infrared optic, at least in the West. But before we go into this, it's worth taking a look back at where exactly this sort of thing came from. So hopefully, well, there's two stories here to go from. First is that of the carbine, and the second is actually of the infrared itself. Now, hopefully, by this point, if you found your way here, you should know the story of the carbine. But if you don't, then very quickly, the M1 carbine was introduced by the US military in 1942, and then the M2, which was the Select Fire version, came in 1944. And then the story behind the infrared is a bit further back and a bit more interesting. The first actual infrared optical devices were actually created in the Netherlands in the late 1920s. And then we get the likes of the Vladimir Zworykin in America, the Radio Corporation of America. He was actually, if you're into your electronics, you might know him as one of the major early television pioneers. He was also quite heavily involved in the development of infrared technology. And so it was his technology with RCA that provided the very first infrared optics that the US used during the Second World War. These were very experimental, but they were nonetheless the first ones used. We could call these Gen 0 night vision. So these were the T120 sniper scope. The Americans called this a sniper scope for reasons which we don't fully know, but it's a quite fitting name. And they invented the first one of these during the Second World War as the T120, and they fitted that to a special version of the carbine, which I have one of right here. And this is the T3. So this varies a little bit from the M2 carbine. It is still fully automatic, as we can see here on this selector switch. But as you can see, there is this big prominent rib on the top. So that is there for fitting this sight to, but this was purposely made for that job. Now, two companies made this, Inland and Winchester. This is an Inland one with this long rib. Winchester did not have this. Unfortunately, we don't actually have the scope for this. We only have the gun, but nonetheless, it's quite a nice little illustrator. Only a few thousand of these were made. Now, these were actually used on Okinawa against the Japanese in the late stages of the Second World War. But they were only really used for observation from defensive positions. They were really a bit too heavy and big and bulky to be of any use out on patrol. And this is sort of an idea of what that would have looked like originally, although the lamp would be on the underside. You're adding a lot to a fairly lightweight rifle. Now, in 1945, of course, very shortly after these were issued, the war ended, and in Europe, the Allies encountered a lot of these German ZG-1229 Vampire infrared sights that they'd been fitting to the Sturmgewehr. And it turned out that these sights were actually really good, certainly a lot better than anything was being put out here in Britain. And so that sort of prompted a rethink about how infrared could be used, and really put a lot of pressure back onto putting an infrared sight on a gun. And so through the late 1940s, we see a development in this direction. So before I go any further into how this actually was used, let's actually have a look at what is going on here. How does it work, and how was the carbine actually modified to suit the rifle? So the carbine here is actually originally an M2, and the markings still say M2 on it. They didn't change that at all. It's just been converted to take this optical system onto it. Now, the way they did that, and I have another example here. First things first, you need to find a way to fit this sight onto it. As much as you can do that from scratch with this T3, that's not really practical. With the carbine series, we see a lot of pushing for the ability to reuse parts from one design into the other. A good example is the paratrooper version, the M1A1. The only thing that's different there is the stock. The entire action fits in exactly the same way. And they wanted to do the same with the M3. So here I've taken one partly apart to show you. You can see that the sight rib is on there again, but now we've got this long bar coming up to the front, and that is attached to a clamp around the barrel in here. Now that basically secures the sight at the front, secures it to the barrel, and then it's secured at the back here to where the rear sight would be. So there are no reserve iron sights on this bad boy. You would then get this screw coming up here. To that you will also attach your grip assembly. Now this grip assembly serves handily as a foregrip, but also it's got this switch on here. This switch operates the lamp. So just to briefly explain, infrared night vision, you might know it today as you've got a pair of goggles on your head, or you've got a sight somewhere on your gun, and it glows up green and it's all good. Nowadays, infrared technology is a lot more sensitive than it was back in these days, so it can pick up the background levels of that infrared radiation. Back in these days, it wasn't sensitive enough at all. That's why this big lamp is on here. So this big lamp has an infrared screen on it, and that will filter out anything but the infrared light. And that is then shining infrared light on your target. That is then reflected back into the scope, and then you can see it more clearly. So that's why this big, weird theme is on the top here. That is a great big lamp providing you some nice invisible light. Now inside here, the main piece of technology that makes this work is what we call the image converter tube. And I just thought it'd be nice to show you one of those. And so I've gone and got one out. And you can see here it's got a lot of glass, so it's very fragile. It's also got a very shiny, polished front face, and on the back it's got this sort of off-green, off-white look to it. And the reason for that, or rather that is the reason why, when you see infrared scopes and infrared night vision, it shows up green. Basically, this is a luminous substance when it's exposed to electricity. And so because this is green, when it's exposed, it shines up green. And so that's why the picture you see is green. It's just because of the stuff that's being used in here. So that's pretty much the gun itself. Other than that, it is still fundamentally an M2 carbine. The one other little addition that we have here at the front is a flash hider. So this is more of a broader thing used with some of the carbines, but you really want it on these sniper scopes and these M3s, because that muzzle flash can cause a lot of havoc with the image that you're seeing through the scope. And also, if you're trying to use this at night and you're trying to be stealthy, you want to hide your muzzle flash so that you don't get seen by the enemy where possible. So that's why that's on there as well, just as a nice little add-on. It's not compulsory, but it's a very, very nice little change. So what I haven't spoken about yet is this, which is the power pack for the sniper scope. Of course, something like this, especially in 1950, takes a lot of power. Especially this takes 20,000 volts, which sounds very high, but the current is actually very low. So if you did actually accidentally touch one of the connectors, you wouldn't be in too much trouble. It's something like 0.03 milliamps. But this has a number of concerns. Firstly, because being 1950s technology, we don't have the modern batteries that we have today. So inside here is basically a giant 6-volt lead acid car battery, full of sulfuric acid. Now, the instruction manuals say that it is of an unspillable type. Practical experience from British forces in Malaya says that's not entirely true. And so a number of these would come back with signs of acid burns because the lead acid had leaked out, which was a bit of a concern for the men using them. But just to give an idea of what is inside, you can see the top of 3 great big battery cells. And so each of those would be full of lovely sulfuric acid. So that's on the top here, and then down at the bottom, you can just about see this opening here. This is where all these cables would plug into. This is the high tension power unit that converts that 6-volt battery up to 20,000 volts. Now this is quite heavy. In fact, all of this together weighs a grand total of about 31 pounds, which is quite some hefty weight. And you see me sort of struggle to lift it up. You can really get a feeling of how heavy this thing is and how useful it is to have that extra foregrip. So one of the questions that people sometimes think about with this thing is, why use the carbine? If you're using infrared night vision, you want to make the most out of it. Why would you use something that is noted for its limited range and a fairly low powered cartridge? You know, the 30 carbine is a skinny little thing. Well, part of it is due to the weight. As I said, this is 31 pounds in total. The German Vampire during the Second World War was attached to a Sturmgewehr, and the major problem there was weight. It was upwards of 40 pounds, which you don't want to be carrying for long periods of time. But also, the lack of range is actually not so much of a problem with this thing. The maximum effective range of this scope is something along the lines of about 100 yards, which is well within the capabilities of the M1 carbine, or the M2, as we have here. And then on top of that as well, the M2 carbine has a fully automatic option. Of course, as nice as it is to have vision at night, you can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to have clear vision. The pictures on these can be quite murky, especially out to those longer ranges. So having automatic fire can be really helpful in that situation. So that's why you see these on the carbine. The carbine really can do the job perfectly fine in terms of the capabilities of this. And then if you're going out in the likes of the jungles of Malaya, or if you're trekking across the tall peaks of Korea, you don't want something that's going to be any heavier than you need it to be. And so the carbine, in that sense as well, was the perfect gun for the job. Now, another question is, why are they here? This is American. We have about 6 of these. Well, these actually saw quite a lot of use by British forces in the 1950s. So these were both in Korea and in Malaya. Now, in Korea, it's a fairly simple, straightforward story. The Americans had them in theatre, and they would issue a number of these out to the British Commonwealth Division, basically on loan. And the consensus was that they were very heavy, but they were very nice. At some point during the conflict, it's noted that apparently they were mainly issued to Australians for a time, who would be attached to different patrols as they were sent out on patrol, and then the man with this would go ahead of everything so they could keep an eye out on things. And they would call these chaps looksies, which is a very, very British Commonwealth way of defining these people. So in Korea it was quite well liked, but again, because we have tall mountains, thick forests, the weight was a bit of an issue, and also the fragility. The battery cells on these, as well as not being truly unspillable, were made of a fairly fragile plastic, which could easily be broken during rough handling. And then we go to Malaya. Malaya is a little more interesting in that the Federation of Malaya government actually bought 12 of these from the US in 1953. And so the Malayan government would then issue them out to British forces rotating in and out of the theatre. And so this is where we get a lot of these problems with spillages of acid, because thick, dense jungle, these things would be getting battered around all the time. The constant threat of ambush, not a great situation to be in. And also, there's also a bit of interesting work on, or literature in who these were given to. In Malaya, there's actually quite a lot of use of, or at least putting a lot of these into the hands of soldiers. But what they actually specifically noted as basically British soldiers were, neither here nor there, nothing particularly special. Fijian soldiers in theatre were noted for their physical strength, and so it was actually considered that they were the best men to give these to, because they could carry them on the long patrols out into the dense jungle. And then there's also the rather disparaging comments that say that they thought the Gurkhas were a bit too weak to carry these, and so not to bother to give them to them. So after the likes of Korea and Malaya, you don't really see these used a lot anymore. The reason why is, as much as this was very well liked and a very useful system for the men who used it, it is simply too heavy and too bulky. And also, it's fragile, frankly. That image converter tube is made of glass. That's a problem. In fact, one of the other problems as well, especially in the likes of the thick jungles, is these would also get filled up with moisture and condensation, which would basically render them useless. So we've got these problems that basically all add up to make this not particularly desirable in the long term. And so as a result, from about the mid-1950s, these really start to die out, and we don't really see their replacement until about maybe 10 years after that. Well, thanks for watching, guys. Do please continue to support us here at the Royal Armouries. We do have, if you're interested, a relatively new book out about the treasures in our collection, some of the highlights of what we have here. And otherwise, all our sites are open. Do feel free to come down to any one of them, and we'll see you next time.